So this week, I'm looking at the passage that is Genesis chapter 21, if you want to turn there. Looking at it, and I'm like, Lord, what am I supposed to do with this thing? And one of the things, I'm going to tell you, what I said earlier about being grateful to have this opportunity, one of the things that I know to be true is that for years and years, Jimmy Akery, who was the pastor at Bacon's Castle, preached a specific way. He would take a book of the Bible and he would start in verse 1 and he would preach through it. And one of the things I learned to appreciate about that is you would hit verses and passages that you would never instinctively preach on because it's just not something that would come up on your radar to preach from. And I knew that that was the correct way to do things. Not that you can't preach topically, but when you preach through the scriptures, you run up against stuff and you have to preach on things that would not normally be done. And this week, in this chapter, this passage, I thought, God, I don't know. And I kept talking to him about it. And he kept ignoring me. And then he gave it to me. And I was so excited. I tell you, I'm excited this morning. My message this morning is titled, A Place Called Beersheba, God's Generational Sanctuary. And we're going to read in Genesis 21. So if you're there, just hold tight. But we're going to read there in a little bit. I want to go back and talk about it just for a moment. The nation of Israel is going to look back on its beginning, still does, and down through history to this day will speak of their founding fathers and the God they worshiped as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, as New Testament believers, we still say of our God that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we should. And here's why we should. Because it helps, just like we're preaching in Genesis and tying it to life today, it helps our children make the connection internally. That this God that's speaking here with Abraham is still the same God that's speaking to us today. That Jehovah that talked to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that Jehovah's Holy Spirit came by the grace of God to me this week and gave a message for us. Like, we are still talking to the same God. That's a big deal. And so we need to say this. And we're in Genesis, though, right now, and where we're preaching from, we're at the beginning of this story. And the players in this story, everything's future for them, right? Jacob's not born. Isaac's just a child at this point. And Abraham is just beginning to comprehend the character and nature of this Jehovah God who's leading him. And just like us, as we begin to follow God and we bow the knee to Jesus Christ and his lordship, our understanding of God grows, right? And as we continue to mature in him, we continue to grow in our understanding of Christ. In fact, I'm not sure, but maturity could be defined as knowing God more and knowing ourselves more. Right? Because the more we know of ourselves, the more we realize how unable we are to do stuff, the greater God appears in our life as he does stuff in our lives, right? But in this particular passage, and as we've looked at the life of Abraham, one of the ways that it shows up in his life is the names that he uses for God when he prays to God. Now, when you go back to when he first shows up in Genesis 12, and God says, I'm calling you out of your country, from your people, and I'm going to make you go to the place that you're supposed to go to, because I want you there. He begins to call on God with this name. He begins to use the word Jehovah. And Jehovah is God's personal name to his people. For everyone else in the Old Testament, in fact, we saw it with Hagar, when God first came to her, the first time she ran away from Sarah, he used the angel of Jehovah came, but later on he would use, when she and Ishmael leaves, he uses the name of God, Elohim, which is like the great God. But it's sort of the God of creation, sort of the God of everybody. Like by definition of being God, he's Elohim, but it's not the covenant God. Abraham is always going to call on God as Jehovah. From the beginning, God comes to him, he makes a covenant with him, and he realizes that this God is personal. Jehovah is God of the covenant. The second change of name is when he meets Melchizedek, and Melchizedek blesses him, and he blesses Melchizedek back, and this is the name he uses, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. There's something else going on here. He is not just personally for me, but he is And he's not just Elohim, Lord of all. He is supreme. He is incredibly sovereign. In fact, maybe that came even from Abraham, 318 guys chasing 4 armies off the field and winning a stunning battle. That you don't do that. Like Gideon later on will take 300 guys and whip 130,000 men. You don't do that unless God is the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth. And then the third name he's going to use is when he's talking to God as God's telling him what he's going to do to Sodom. And he says to God in that moment, will the judge of all the earth do right? The judge of all the earth. That's another name. That's another understanding. God has the right to judge. He's growing. He's increasing in his understanding, not just of who God is, but of even the scope of who God is. And today we're going to be introduced to another name. This name will be at the end of the passage we're reading, and it is Jehovah El Olam, or it means literally Jehovah the everlasting God. And he'll call on the name of Jehovah the everlasting God. That's going to be significant as we go through this passage today, because the reality is he's coming to terms with this. Abraham is coming to terms with this. The very same God who began the covenant with Abraham is going to keep it and uphold it forever. All right, let's read Genesis 21, verses 22 through 34. At that time, Abimelech, accompanied by Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Swear to me by God, here and now, that you will not break an agreement with me or with my children and descendants. As I have been loyal to you, so you will be loyal to me and to the country where you are a foreign resident. And Abraham said, I swear it. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the water well that Abimelech's servants had seized. Abimelech replied, I don't know who did this thing. You didn't report anything to me, so I hadn't heard about it until today. Abraham took sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. Abraham separated 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, why have you separated these 7 ewe lambs? And he replied, you are to accept the 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that this act will serve as my witness that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because it was there that the two of them swore an oath. After they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of Jehovah, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived as a foreigner in the land of the Philistines for many days. Let's pray. Father, I ask as we go through this passage today that you would translate it into our world, that you would take it from 3,800 years ago, Lord, to present day 2026, that you would cause us to see that not only did Abraham hear from the one true God, but Abraham heard from and spoke with you, who we are currently speaking with, and whom Abraham is with right now. Father, we are bound together in a chain that goes back through the ages because of eternal life that was given on the cross through Jesus Christ. We are one. We are connected. Abraham is still our father of faith, Lord, that we look to him still to this day as our inspiration for walking with you. And Lord, today as we go through this piece, would you just direct us? Show us ourselves, Lord, and show us yourself. Show us yourself as Jehovah, the everlasting God, today. In Christ's name, amen. All right, I have 4 places today that we're going to look at. And if you want to write them down, they are as such. Beersheba is, number 1, a place of peace, where the world admits God's truth. Beersheba is, number 2, a place of provision, where the water flows in the desert. And number 3, Beersheba is a place of prayer, where the worshiper calls on God. And number 4, Beersheba is a place of permanence, where the wanderers come home. Only 2 places in the scriptures are associated with all 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these 2 places are the town of Hebron. In fact, if you're reading Abraham's story, you'll often see oaks of Mamre, and that's a connection there to Hebron. But Hebron We know that all three of them were in Hebron, and the other place is this, what just shows up today, Beersheba. Now, Beersheba, the word means well of the oath or well of seven, because the word Sheba actually is a sort of play on words. It can either mean oath or it can mean seven. But in the context of the passage today, it sounds like he's saying well of the oath, because it says there they had an oath. And at Beersheba, all of them will be given peace from God in difficult times. Every one of those three men. And they will be given provisions where there shouldn't have been any. They're in the wilderness. They're going to all call on the name of Jehovah or hear from Jehovah. Beersheba would be the tie that will hook all three of them covenantally to their generational God. So let's look at the first point. The first point is a place of peace. Beersheba is a place of peace where the world admits God's truth. As we're reading this, the thing that pops right up, and the first thing is Abimelech. Abimelech recognized that God was with Abraham. Now, this is the same Abimelech that had taken Sarah, and Abraham got in trouble, and Sarah got in trouble, and Abimelech got in trouble, and it made a big mess. This is the same Abimelech. This is a little bit later because Isaac is born now. Hagar and Ishmael have left. So I want you to hear what I'm saying. Abimelech recognized that God was with Abraham in spite of that whole episode with Sarah. He recognized it, I think, probably also because Isaac's birth was clearly miraculous. Keep in mind that Sarah had been in his house and nobody was having babies because there was bad things happening there. Sarah goes home, and within a tiny amount of time, she's pregnant when she should not have been pregnant and has a baby. He can't help but notice the situation. And he also recognized that God was with Abraham in spite of the problems in Abraham's household. I'm guessing that Abimelech was probably invited to that whole weaning party for Isaac. So he may have been privy to the explosion in the household. He certainly would have known if he was any interaction with Abraham that something bad had happened, and the woman that he thought was Abraham's wife and the son that was Abraham's son is now gone and nobody knows where. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know why, I don't have an answer for this. I don't know why Abimelech chose where Beersheba is to come to Abraham with these, we need to make an oath to not hurt each other, terms of peace. Unless, which is the probable thing, Abraham just happened to be there when he decided that this was something that needed to happen. Beersheba on the map is in a straight line is about 23 to 25 miles from the town of Gerar, which was the capital of the Abimelech's capital at the time. Which actually doesn't seem very far for us in today's world. Like, that would be a little bit, maybe from here to the power plant. Would that be about right? Would that be about 20, 25 miles from here? Something like that, right? And you think, my goodness, they could be in the same county, but if I had to take just the 11 cows that we have, every time I needed to go somewhere, if I had to drag those along with me, I wouldn't move very fast anywhere. It's hard enough for us to get out the door just with people. But if you've got thousands and thousands of sheep moving around, you probably don't get anywhere very fast in your life. So 25 miles, and it's in the wilderness, it's probably mountainous terrain. There's not roads like we have, so that's a big difference in how you move. But at any rate, this time when Abimelech comes to him, he's just at a well in the desert. In fact, Abraham has dug the well. And interestingly, good morning, Tom. Interestingly, at this very place, something is going to happen that's going to be bizarre. If you continue reading forward in Genesis, the almost word for word scenario happens to Isaac years and years later. In fact, let's just turn to Genesis 26 because it's so interesting that I think we need to just look at it for briefly. Turn to Genesis 26. And there, we're not going to read the whole thing, but he gets in a fight with Abimelech because Abimelech's guys keep taking his wells, and he keeps moving further and further out into the wilderness. And finally, he gets to Beersheba, and the Lord appears to him. But then, after that, Abimelech comes to him from Gerar with Ahusamach, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army. And Isaac says, "Why have you come to me? You hated me and sent me away." And they said, "We clearly see that the Lord has been with you. We need to make an oath." And they make an oath, and they make it at this well. And then Isaac's servants who've been digging a well this whole time came the same day and they said, hey, we found water in our well. And so they named it Beersheba. So they renamed the same place that Abraham has named already in the exact same place. Now, this one's not going to be the same Abimelech. Evidently, Abimelech and Phicol were probably like titles for the king and the commanders of that particular spot. But bizarrely happens exactly the same to Isaac as it happens to Abraham. I don't know that it was bizarre. I think it was probably the same precedent in both situations. But Abimelech comes to him, and just like he would come to Isaac later on, when he came to Isaac, there had been hostility. So he was obviously trying to deal with let's not have a fight between us because we don't want to have a fight. But here at this point, I think there may have been hostility between Abraham, now we're going back to Abraham, not Isaac, and the Philistine world of Abimelech. And the reason I say that is, maybe that's why Abraham was off in the wilderness. Remember, Beersheba is in the middle of nowhere. Beersheba, as we know it today, is a town, but at this point, he could have called it the middle of nowhere, and that would have been a precise location for it. It just was out in the wilderness. There was nothing there, except that they had a well. They had dug a well, and they were getting water from it. I'll tell you the truth. Kind of wonder if it wasn't the same place that God showed Hagar, because she got lost in the wilderness of Beersheba. And wouldn't it be interesting if the water that God caused to be there for Hagar turned out to be the well that Abraham then used later on. But at any rate, he's out there. And keep in mind, he's away from Gerar at this point. He's away from the Philistines. But when this whole thing went down with Sarah going to Abimelech's household, and Abimelech had the dream, God said, hey, you're a dead man if you don't do something different. When he told the dream to his household the next day, they were terrified. So oftentimes, just like with Lot, oftentimes when you have somebody that's afraid and then you have this figure that looks like the problem, there's resentment back and forth. However it is, Abimelech is concerned. He doesn't want Abraham and his household of trained servants, warriors, getting into a fight with his guys. And so he comes out and he wants to have a treaty between them. And another thing that's interesting is maybe this oath needs to be made, this covenant between them needs to be made because he was not able to marry Sarah. See, if he had been able to take one of Abraham's women and put it into his harem, then there would have been an automatic connection, family connection there, and so they would have kind of a built-in oath. For whatever reason, that doesn't say why, and it doesn't give us any indication. At the same time, Abimelech's men seized Abraham's well. Now keep in mind, they're way off in the wilderness. Nobody's paying any attention to them. They're not bothering the Philistines. Was it a band of rogue soldiers? I don't know, but they come in and they take this well that Abraham has dug for his people. And Abimelech and Phicol come and they want Abraham to swear an oath of loyalty to them. We want to have this covenant between us so that we're not going to fight you and you're not going to fight us and we're just going to get along and not be a problem. And Abraham agrees to do that. And he enters, he says, I swear to it. He enters into a covenant with Abimelech and he does something now for Abimelech. He gives back to Abimelech sheep and cows, probably lots of them. Was it significant? It doesn't say how many. And I don't know how many sheep and cows Abraham had, but I'm sure he had a lot of them because he was a great man. So was it significant? It would have been significant to me. I only have 11 cows. So if I had to give 11 cows, that'd be all I had. Whether it's significant to him or was it just, this is a lot no matter what it is. But it cost him. And his payment to Abimelech and the loyalty oath allowed them to have rest. Abimelech the king and Phicol the general were present, as well as all the people, servants. I'm assuming they brought an entourage with them as well. Abraham's servants are there. And they witnessed this covenant between Abraham and the Philistines. So there could be no denying it later on. That was important. Remember, you don't have, unlike Surrey County that can take its records way, way, way back, there is no county seat to put records in to say, did Abimelech and Abraham have this? No, it was just if whatever people could remember. Which brings us to the second point. The second point, or the second place, is a place of provision, where the water flows in the desert. In the middle of this desert, and this is desert area, okay? Nobody wants to live here. That's why nobody's living there. Nobody wants to live out there in the desert. There's nothing there. But God gives them a well of water. Now, if you live, in fact, there was a show we watched What's it called? The Marty Rainey show. What was that called? Homestead Rescue. Thank you. Oh, I love that show. But one of the things they always did, they'd go to these people in the desert and they'd try to help these homesteaders in the desert. And they're drilling wells trying to find water because you can't live without water, right? God gives them this well, and he is providing. That well must have been amazing to provide for an entire camp of people with all these animals and everything. And Abimelech's men come in and somehow decide they're going to take it. Now, doesn't know why, but it had to be frustrating. Had to be frustrating to Abraham to probably leave what was decent pasture land, because there was probably some conflict between him and Abimelech. Hey, everybody, we're just going to move out into the wilderness where nobody's going to bother us because nobody wants this land, right? We're going to take the bad land. We're going to go to the desert, and God will provide. And he did provide. He got this well for them, and they're grateful for it, only to have Abimelech's men come along behind him and say, hey, you can't have that well. That's our well. And I want to tell you something. I don't know how you feel about that, but if somebody tried to take that away from me, I don't want to fight. But Abraham's men, there's no record that they fought. In fact, when Isaac's servants went through it, they did not fight. So I'm assuming that Abraham did not as well. So here you have this band of men that have come into Abraham's camp and have surrounded the well. You can't have his well. Now listen, I just said that God made this a place of provision. He gave them a well. Why would he let Abimelech's men come in and for no reason take it away from them? Here's the reality. We feel that often. We feel the same way. God provides something. And then we're like, wait, I thought that was for me, right, Frank? I thought that was for me. How come that guy has it over there? That job offer was mine. And the dude that got it isn't even as qualified as me. And you think, man, where's the provision? Well, it's right there. The well's right there. We can see the water, but we can't get to it because these guys are... And Abraham's back there saying, men, don't fight him. These are the same men that chased 4 armies. They could have wiped those guys out without any trouble, but they didn't. Why? We're going to look at this a little bit. I remember years ago, those of you that might know Focus on the Family, Dr. Dobson, Dr. James Dobson, he was talking about his father, who was an evangelist, pastor and evangelist, and he said he grew up dirt poor. And he said this one specific story. He said his dad had been asked to go to another church and preach a week of revival meetings, and he did. And he said, we desperately needed the money that church was going to pay him for these revival meetings. He said, we desperately needed. He was a kid in the home at the time. And he said, when my dad came home, my mom said, how much did they pay you? And he said, Dad said, sweetheart, the family I was staying with needed it worse than us. Now, for you wives that take care of the finances, you can appreciate how she must have felt in that moment. Why would God provide for Dr. Dobson's dad only to have it go to somebody else, right? We feel that way. It's the unfairness. Why is it that God provided and then he takes it away? But the reality is he didn't take it away. He was testing Abraham. Are you going to trust me? Or are you going to trust your sword? Because that's really what it boils down to oftentimes. And Abimelech comes on the scene and he makes it. And it had to be frustrating to Abraham, too, to have Abimelech show up in the middle of all this and say, hey, let's make a peace deal. Your dudes are over there keeping us from our water. Like, come on, man, what are you doing? But Abraham takes his word when Abimelech says, hey, I don't know anything about this. Did he know something about it? I don't know. I have to take his word, too, because it doesn't say anything different. But Abraham does something very interesting. As he makes this covenant with Abimelech, and as he has all these sheep and cattle that probably the herders just come up and amass over there to Abimelech's side, he brings 7 little lambs up along with it. There's probably an entire sermon in this 7 little lambs story. We're not going to go there, but I want to just talk about it a little bit. When he does that, Abimelech says to him, what's this? What are these 7 lambs about? And honestly, when you look at it, you think, oh my goodness, there's like 1,000 sheep over there. What's the point of these 7? And Abraham says, this is a witness. Now, Has to be all of the servants and everybody standing around, right, as this is all going down. And Abraham, not a servant, Abraham takes these lambs and leads them over and hands Abimelech the leads for them. Why is that significant? Abraham says, this, Abimelech, this, like it's not impersonal anymore. This is me giving these little innocent lambs to you in exchange for your promise that this well is mine. He didn't fight him. He didn't say, come and get this well if you can. He said, I'm reaching out to you in peace. In fact, later on in Jacob's life, remember when Jacob comes back, him and Esau have been separated for years, and Jacob comes back, and Esau, he finds out Esau is coming to him with 400 armed men. They're not armed for nothing. They're going to wipe this brother of mine off the map. And what does Jacob do? When he gets to him, he bows on his face to his brother. And I believe he bows 7 times. There is something in the humility of this great man, not letting it off to some servant, but taking those 7 little lambs and saying, Abimelech, I'm asking you to honor the promise that this well will be mine. What is Abimelech to do when he's standing in front of a bunch of people and that kind of humility is displayed in front of him? He says, the well is yours and I'll never bother you. And so, Abraham creates the name in that moment, Beersheba, well of the oath, well of 7. So here's a question. Coming off of that, I just said that God made a place of provision for them. Did God provide the well of provision or did Abraham? Remember, Abraham dug it. I said Abraham dug it, but really his servants dug it. But Abraham's servants dug this well. In other words, he did all the work. And then he pays for it. He didn't demand it. He didn't chop it up in people to get it. He just paid for it. It wasn't even Abimelech's land. Remember, he goes back to the land of the Philistines. This is just desert. So how is this a place of God's provision? The well had been there. They dug it. They were using it until Abimelech's guys come up and take them away from him. How is it God's provision? If Abraham dug it, Abraham paid for it, where was God in the whole process? Here's where God was. Only God can make streams in the desert. Now, years ago, I came home from work one day. This was back when I was still living with my folks at home, and I was in the middle of a situation that I did not like, and I didn't have any idea how to deal with. But I remember coming home from work one day, and Ralph, I flipped my Bible open, and I flipped it open to Isaiah chapter 43. And I was arguing with the Lord about something that I didn't want to change. I wanted it to be this way, and He was wanting it to be this way, and I did not want to give up. And so I said to the Lord, direct me. And I flipped open to Isaiah 43 and I started to read. And listen to what it says in Isaiah 43 verse 18. Do not remember the past events. Pay no attention to things of old. Look, boy, this got my attention. Look, I'm about to do something new. Even now it's coming. Do you not see it? Indeed, I will make a way in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. The animals of the field will honor me, the Lord says, jackals and ostriches, because I provide water in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to give drink to my chosen people. The people I formed for myself will declare my praise. I read that many years ago and I said, you got me, Lord. Do what you need to do. And I gave up. And He did what He needed to do and He fixed the situation for me. And I can say with gratitude looking back that I'm so glad I didn't strong-arm God and chop people to pieces and fix the situation my way, but let Him bring water where He needed to bring it. That is why God is the provider of this well, because, in fact, I was actually going to bring it this morning, and I was thought about it. There's a bedtime story that I grew up with Uncle Arthur's bedtime stories. That was a set of books we had in our house. And there's a story in there about a missionary family on the field, and it was in Africa, I think. And their well had dried up. It was a drought, and it was a drought, and it was a drought, and everything was dry. And finally, the mission well ran dry. Buddy, when your well runs dry, you're done. And they were praying, and this little girl, this little missionary kid said, Lord, You don't have to send rain, just send water in the well. And all the older, wiser, smarter missionaries smiled and thought, silly little girl, you have to have rain because it goes down and goes into the well, and that's how you get water. But she knew that God could provide water where there was no water. And she went out after the prayer meeting and opened the lid and dropped a pebble, and it hit water, and there had been no rain. And they said from that point on, that well never again ran dry. Why? Because God provides water where there isn't water. You can dig to China. You can pay a fortune. And on that homestead rescue thing, they would pay a fortune sometimes. Digging and digging and digging, trying to find water. You can dig till you're blue in the face. Only God makes streams at the bottom of that hole. All we do is dig. He provides the water. And years later, he'd do it for the children of Israel when they're wandering in the desert and they run out of water, and God says to Moses, strike that rock, and he struck it, and boom. How does water come out of a rock? He says, I'm going to make rivers flow in the desert where there aren't any, because God does that. And so out in the wilderness, where no one cared about the land, they just wanted to be troublesome, God gave them what they had to have to live, water. And God did it in such a way. Listen, Abraham didn't fight for it. Abraham let God fight for it. He humbled himself. And Abraham had a sworn oath by the end of the day from the man who controlled that territory that that well would be and is now and would always be Abraham's well. No questions asked, and it was never challenged to my knowledge. Beersheba had become a place of peace, and now it was truly a place of provision. And finally, in the third place, it was a place of prayer. A place of prayer where the worshiper calls on God. At this point in the story, Abimelech and Phicol have covenanted with Abraham for peaceful relationships. They've moved on. They've gone back to Philistines, to Gerar, about 25 miles away. And Abraham is at peace, and he has been provided for. So life is good for him at this point. Life is relieving for him at this point, right? He's still in the desert. It's still hot. It's still dry. It's still difficult. But God has answered some of those questions, and now it's time for prayer. But before he prays, he plants trees. And when I read this, I thought, when you run across something that's such a bizarre detail, you're like, oh, there's got to be something in that. But what? And I'm looking, I'm like, what? In fact, honestly, through the rest of the Old Testament, God has them cutting down trees all the time. You know why? Because they plant groves of trees on the top of a high hill, and they build an altar, and they worship some false god there. And so he has them, the prophets come in and have to cut these trees down. And I'm like, wait, he's planting a tree, and he's calling on the name of the Lord there. Is this significant? It is significant, by the way. Abraham, listen, is going to call on the name of Jehovah, Elolam, for the first time. Jehovah, God of the covenant, Elolam, the everlasting God. Abraham is for the first time calling on the God who will be here forever. His perspective has shifted. What happened? Up to this point, what has he been doing with his life? He's been living, waiting for what? For Isaac. God said, I'm promising you a son. You don't get to have the great generations and nations that come until the son is coming. But the son has come. So now what's he doing? All of a sudden, there's something beyond the baby. His perspective has shifted. And Abraham is now realizing he's over 100 years old. There's no way he should have had this child, but he has it. And he's realizing that the promised son and the covenant attached to it and the great nation that's going to come from Abraham, all of that will continue to be fulfilled long after he's gone. That's the shift. It's not just about me anymore. And the everlasting God, from Abraham suddenly realizing the everlasting God is still going to be here, fulfilling all of this and directing the covenant. He's not going to be there to do it. The everlasting God is going to do it. And he calls on Jehovah, the everlasting God, for the first time. His perspective has enlarged on who God is and what he's going to do. And so in a physical act of trust for that fulfillment, Abraham planted a tree. Now, at my house, we have one huge pecan tree, and we have many small pecan trees. And I will tell you this, I was at a friend's house probably 10 years ago, And he was pruning his trees in his front yard. And I said, hey, what you doing? I'm pruning my trees. I said, what kind of trees are you? He said, oh, they're flowering plums. I said, flowering plums? What is the point of a flowering plum? Just plant a plum. It flowers, then you get fruit. He's like, I know. He said, I should have done that. He said, I've been thinking about that. I should have put fruit trees in. I said, well, you still can. He said, but if I put them in now, I got to wait 5 years. I'm like, well, I said, if you don't put them in now, in 5 years, you'll still be waiting because you still haven't put them in the ground. When you plant a tree, what are you doing? You are planting forward. When I plant a pecan tree at my house, I am not going to benefit from that pecan tree, especially not the size that it is. Like, I might get some pecans off of it, but you don't get to sit under a shade of a 100-foot tall pecan tree in your own lifetime. You plant it for someone else. In fact, I read a story years ago about, I think it was in the Black Forest in Germany. It was a multi-generational wood, like a milling company. And they would harvest these great big trees in the forest. And every time on this land that this company owned, when they cut a tree down, they planted another one. And they cut them down at a rate that was sustainable so that they would have enough, and there would be enough there for their children and enough time for those ones that they planted for their great-grandchildren to harvest them. Do you know what that's doing? That is looking forward and making something that you'll never be a part of. That is a covenantal way of thinking about things. To see that God is overarching everything, and your children mean something, and your grandchildren mean something, and your great-grandchildren, and if you fail, your great-grandchildren's milling operation will shut down. Cut too quick, your children won't be able to do it. You have to think forward. And this is what Abraham's doing here. This is why it's so important. In fact, this particular tree, King James, I think, says he planted a grove, but they think it's probably the tree, it's called a tamarisk tree. I didn't know what it was. I had to look it up, but I looked up some cool stuff about it. The tamarisk tree likes hot and dry because it has long roots that go deep. And you know what's amazing with a tamarisk tree? They said the shade of a tamarisk tree is much cooler than other trees. Now, it's not a big tree. In fact, what it looks like to me, if you go down to the Outer Banks, you know, the low, scrubby trees that are down there that are just kind of bent sideways, that's what it looks like. But I was showing the kids a picture of one of them, and it was this, you know, it was like come up out of the ground, and it just kind of went sideways for a way out. And I said, look at that. Look at the shade that thing would produce. But they said, because the roots tap into deep water, it evaporates a lot more water into the air than a regular tree does, and so the shade is much cooler. So when he plants this tree, is Abraham going to get the benefit from this? No. It said it's 50 to 100 years to, you know, in its maturity. So by the time this tree that he planted was a fully mature tree, Abraham would be dead. Who will it be for? It's for the forward thinkingness of it. He's looking at that tree and he's saying, this well, God just gave me this well forever, and he is going to fulfill my covenant forward. He's going to make a great nation out of me. I'm going to do something. I'm going to plant a tree beside a well in a dry and desert place so that when my descendants come, they can drink from this well and they can sit under the shade of this tree. And I won't be here, but the God of the covenant will use what I need. The everlasting God will use what I've given here forward. That's a big deal to me. Many years later, when Isaac would come to Beersheba, he would come back. He would probably enjoy this tree, actually. And then God would come to him there, and he would say, I'm the God of your father Abraham. And again, years after that, when Jacob comes to Beersheba, and he will, God will come to him and say, I'm the God of your father. Beersheba, the place of prayer, would introduce, through Abraham, Jehovah, the everlasting God, to the generations to follow. For Abraham, remember, this is new for him. He's looking forward. He has no idea what's going to happen. All he knows is God promised his son and he gave him one. So if he gave him a son that he promised, he's able to fulfill the rest of them, right? For Isaac and Jacob, when they show up at Beersheba years later, God will say to them, I'm the God of your father. Follow me. Both directions. He's the everlasting God. And Abraham, anticipating the future with the eternal God firmly in charge, planted a tree that would shade his people for centuries, and then he called it Well of the Oath, which brings us to the fourth point, a place of permanence. Beersheba is a place of permanence where the wanderers come home. After the book of Genesis, Beersheba, if you look it up in the Strong's Concordance or some kind of concordance, it's used frequently. But Beersheba becomes something different than what it is where we're reading here in Genesis. Beersheba simply becomes the name of the city that defines the southern edge of the promised land. And so this is what they'll say over and over and over. Here's 1 Samuel 3:20. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba. And by the way, Dan is the northern city. It sits above the Sea of Galilee. And it's the one, if you go back to the passage where Abraham chases the four kings out of town, it says he chased them as far as Dan. Dan is the northernmost city, and Beersheba becomes the southernmost city. So this is how it will be used all the way, pretty much completely for the rest of the Old Testament. It's going to be used this way, as a placeholder, as a marker, to establish, 2 Samuel 3:10, to establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. 2 Samuel 17:11, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba. 2 Samuel 24:2, all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. It becomes a place that is a recognizable, understandable boundary. There's a scripture that talks about the ancient paths. Is that the Jeremiah passage that you read about the ancient paths? Might have been.
No, that's the one about putting the deeds
Yes.
into earth.
Oh, and put them into a vessel. That's right.
They may last many days.
That's right. So he talks about going back to the ancient paths. This is one of the reasons he'd be talking about. Beersheba becomes the marker. From Dan to Beersheba, this is the boundary for the land. And it's not a coincidence. Listen, it is not a coincidence that the very place where God met all three patriarchs, and they all called on the name of Jehovah there, turns out to be not just the marker, but the southern entrance to the promised land. I want to go to Genesis 46. This is where Jacob shows up there. Genesis 46, verse 1 says, Israel, that's Jacob, set out with all of his... This is after Joseph is made second in command to Pharaoh down in Egypt. And he sends back for his dad and everybody to come down and live with him. Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba. And he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And that night God spoke to Israel in a vision. Jacob, Jacob, he said, and Jacob replied, Here I am. God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will bring you back. For him, it was a place of peace at that moment because he was able to hear from God that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. And the last place that Jacob sees as he leaves Canaan for Egypt is Beersheba. That's his last glimpse of the promised land. And God says, don't worry, I've got it. I'll bring them back. I am the everlasting God, the God of the covenant. I'm going down with you. Do not be afraid. And you know, when Israel, listen, when the nation of Israel, when Moses comes in and all the plagues happen and they get released, when the nation of Israel came out of Egypt and God brought them back, do you know where he brought them back to? Right back to that point. They're in Kadesh Barnea, which is just a little bit south of there. And God says, or Moses has the 12 spies sent out. And the 12 spies go up to the land. And when they go up to the land, they go up past the well of the oath. They go up right past Beersheba. They go all the way to the top of the land of Canaan. They turn around and come back down. And they come back past the well of the oath, past Beersheba. In fact, my guess is, being one of the only wells around, they probably drank from it. Now think about that. You wander into a well in the middle of nowhere, and it's got these trees around it. And you think about this story, and you're like, man, 400 years ago, Father Abraham did this. That isn't what they were thinking. You know what they came back thinking? All they could think was how big the giants were in the land. They didn't see the God of the covenant. They didn't see what God had established. And they come back, not Joshua and Caleb. Make sure of that, right? Not Joshua and Caleb, but the other 10. Their fear started a rebellion against God in the camp of Israel. And it ruined everything. Had Israel not rebelled and been sent in the desert for 40 years as a punishment, this would have been their entry point. And they would have come back into the promised land, right where God told Jacob that he was going to do it, at the same place that Jacob was promised by Jehovah, the everlasting God. past the tamarisk trees planted in a grove around some wells in the middle of nowhere. 2 million people strong, a great nation walking into the promised land, right past the very spot where Abraham called on Jehovah, the everlasting God, who was his God and who would be the God of his descendants, the Israelites. Can you imagine if that had happened and Abraham in the spirit could have seen forward like John did in Revelation and could have stood there at Beersheba and watched this group of people 400 years in the future filing past? He would have been stunned to disbelief that the God of the covenant could pull that off. But you know what happened? The faith in this everlasting God wasn't as strong in the offspring as it was in Abraham. And what could have been an amazing picture of God's sovereignty and glory, they messed it up by rebelling against him. And yet, listen, the great faith of Abraham, if you know your Old Testament, the faith of Abraham would keep these faithless children many times from being destroyed as God chose, as God took a deep breath before wiping them off the map for one more time of complaining, and he would honor the vow and the promise that he made to their father Abraham. These 2 million strong people who would refuse to do what God said to do, God would honor one man's complete faith and obedience in him and would keep them. He said to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And that, by definition, kept those people alive long enough to get to the promised land. All right, how does this apply to us? I'm going to say this before I go to the application. I understand that when this is like rolling and burning in my heart for days on end, that you may not feel it the same way as I do at this moment, but this is a big deal. We still serve the same Jehovah, the same yesterday, today, and forever, everlasting God. He is still our God. It's an astonishing thing. Find another religion in the world that can tell you that. There isn't one. His name is Jesus. You see, Abraham's faith was expanded and his names of God were expanded to accommodate it. And one day, our name of God got expanded one more time, and we found out that his name is Jesus. Jehovah has a name, and his name is Jesus. And Paul said he's the ultimate fulfillment of what God told Abraham. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And he has given us, listen, this is for us. He has given us a place of our own called Beersheba, well of the oath, a place of peace and provision and prayer and permanence. And you know where it is? It's himself. Matthew 11 says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. You shall find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. John 4 says, remember, Jesus was talking to the woman at the well. He was talking to another woman at a woman at another well, and he says, how about some water? And she says, and they get in a conversation, and Jesus says, listen, if you knew who I was, you would ask me for a drink. And she didn't know what he was talking about, but we do. He said, everyone who drinks from the water, he's our Beersheba. Everyone who drinks from the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. And the water that I give him will become a well of water springing up out of him in eternal life. You will not only drink from the well, you will become a well for others to drink from. That's a big deal. You're not just consuming, you become part of the process of giving it out. He's our Beersheba, but to drink of his well, listen, you're going to drink from the well in Beersheba. You have to do something that no one else will do. You got to live in the wilderness. See, that's a part of the problem that we don't, as a modern church, we don't like to accommodate that. We say, well, we can be like the world. We can live where the world lives. We can do whatever the world does. No, he says, you want to walk with me and you want to drink from my living water, you got to be where I'm at. And I'm at the well out in the wilderness. And there by that well, that our Lord planted as a grove of trees to refresh us. He doesn't leave us in the wilderness with nothing. He leaves us in the wilderness with peace and provision and a place to pray and a permanent location. Those trees don't look like much to the world around us. They look scruffy and scrawny, and they wonder why we come and hang out there. But we rejoice in the shade of those weather-beaten little shade trees. Listen, as I'm going through this and I'm thinking about where we're at as a church, and I'm thinking about the provision that God is making for us, and the charter that we just signed, do you know what that charter represents? It represents something, what I'm about to say here. Those trees are the church that Jesus planted, not the Pope, not some patriarch, not some good preacher. Jesus planted them. And do you know where you get shade? You get shade under the trees that Jesus planted. The plain, simple, unpretentious New Testament church. That's what our charter is about. Going back to what it means to be a well in the desert with water coming in it from the Lord and a bunch of scrawny trees above it, waiting, rejoicing for desert wanderers to come in who are thirsty. No frills. No frills. The Church of Jesus doesn't have frills. We're not about fancy. You know what we are about? Genuine rest for weary souls. You know, if you're wandering around in the desert and you're lost, you know how you got there? You got lost following mirages. They look like water and they look like trees, but they're not. And one day, you're thirsting to death. You're walking through the wilderness and you're dying, and if you don't find water soon, you're going to be done. And you look up and you think there's a mirage ahead of you. But it's worth one more chance. And you stumble in and it's not a mirage, it's Beersheba, and there's trees there. And there's some folks there and they say, here, come get a drink. Come lay over here in the shade. You'll live. That's what happened with Hagar and Ishmael. God said, here's a well. Come drink some water. That's what we're for. We are to be by the well in the middle of nowhere, trees. That's our job. We send our roots way down to the water so that we can be green when anything else isn't. And then as weary, thirsty people come staggering in, beat up, worn out, and hurting, we can give them shade and love and water. And we can restore their souls, like Psalm 23 says. And you know what we'll get out of it? Not much, except on the other side, where it's going to be lush and green and beautiful. But between now and then, this is what we'll get. We'll get the joy of real fellowship with fellow travelers going through the desert on the way to the promised land. That's what we get. And we'll be mocked by the big, pretty churches with luscious growth around them in the cities. And we'll have to say to them, where's your well? Because the only one I know about is out here in the wilderness. What are you drinking from? I want to drink living water from a well that God said is full of it. Jesus is our Beersheba. May we as a church be a refreshing grove of tamarisk trees, scrubby little scrawny, nobody wants some trees, but provide beautiful shade for somebody who's worn out. Blessing other desert wanderers who came in just like we did and found an oasis where there wasn't any. That's my message this morning.